Good evening, everyone. Good to be with you. My name's Dave. I'm one of the pastors here, and tonight I have the privilege of preaching alongside Lydia. I'm just going to close this up first. Lydia is our intern at Gold Hill. She is a wonderful and gifted young woman, and it's a privilege to be preaching alongside her tonight. And we're continuing to look at signs of life. If you need a Bible, if you don't have a Bible with you or someone next to you doesn't and you'd like to follow along, I'd strongly encourage it. You can whack your hand up and David or one of the team will wing a Bible towards you. So last week, Malcolm kicked off a series looking at the miracles that are described in John's Gospel. And in John, they're referred to as signs, not just as miracles or displays of power, as they're referred to in other parts of the Bible. But in John, he seems to refer to them again and again as signs. And each of them points us to something. What is the point of a sign? What does a sign do? Well, if you think of a signpost, the purpose of it is to point you somewhere else. That's fairly basic stuff. You don't ever look at a signpost that says, this way to Chalfont St. Peter, and go, oh, that is a lovely signpost. I'm really excited about that signpost saying this way to Chalfont St. Peter. I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to look at this signpost for a while and just enjoy the signpost. No. You look at it, and you go, great, I can get to Chalfont St. Peter now. This may be a good thing. You may prefer not to. It depends what you think of the village. But a signpost is designed to point you towards something else. And these signs are incredible things. These miracles that Jesus does are amazing things. And there could be a temptation, as we looked last week at Jesus turning water into wine. There could be a temptation, as we look this week, at two ways in which Jesus healed people, that we look at these stories and go, wow, these stories are great. These stories are cool. Let's think about these stories. That's an okay thing to do. But actually, we miss something if we don't say, what are these stories trying to tell us about something else? Where are these stories trying to point us beyond themselves and towards something else? Malcolm was sort of explaining last week that the way these signs work is that they're things that happened once. They're events, they're stories, they're historical accounts of things that happened once. Only once. But they point us to things that last forever. So last week, Jesus only ever turned water into wine once, that we know of. It's likely he only ever did that once in his life. But the fact that he brings joy and that he brings exuberance and that he makes parties alive and that he brings joyful, full living, that lasts forever. That's something that we can always experience. He only does the sign once, but the thing the sign points to lasts forever. So as we look at these signs, I want to draw your attention to the end of John's Gospel. In John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. It's right near the end of this story. This is John explaining why he's written this whole book down. We read this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Ultimately, that's the purpose of this. These are signs which point us to the one who can give us life. These are signs that give us reasons to believe that Jesus is who he said he was. He can do these things. He can do so much more. So as we explore these two stories today, Lydia's going to lead us off by exploring the first one with us. As we explore these things, I want you to be asking the question, what do I make of this? Do I believe what this sign is saying? Do I want to go where this sign is leading? Lydia.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening, everybody. Jesus has the power to heal. Anywhere, anytime, anyone. And tonight, as Dave says, we're going to be exploring each of these kind of remits through looking at two healings recorded in John's Gospel. And if you have your Bibles, could you turn with me to John 4? Starting at verse 46. And I'm going to read the first of these signs. Then he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine. Now there was a royal official whose son lay ill in Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, He went and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. As he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. So he asked them the hour when he began to recover, and they said to him, "Yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him." The father realized that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he himself believed, along with his whole household. Now this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. So John sets the scene explaining that Jesus had gone back to Cana, which is where this miraculous water got turned into wine by Jesus. And Malcolm spoke on this last week, like Dave said. And it kind of serves as a not so subtle nod to Jesus' character. What we already know about him, not only that he is powerful enough to turn water into wine, but he is powerful enough to transform lives. In this story, not only is a boy miraculously healed from the point of death, but a whole household believes and has their lives changed through encountering Jesus and seeing something of him. Often in the Gospels, we read stories of healing where Jesus is in the vicinity with people. He is right there and then in front of them. But here, the sick son wasn't with Jesus. He was in Capernaum. And it was a desperate father who made what was probably over a day's journey to beg Jesus for this healing. Maybe he'd heard about the water into wine. Maybe he'd heard rumors of this Jesus and needed to know if Jesus was powerful enough. He had some shred of faith to make this journey. He figured that Jesus could heal his son even if his son wasn't geographically with him. And that's exactly what happened. Despite Jesus not ever meeting the son, he had the power to heal simply by speaking. Verse 53 gives us the confirmation the official received, realizing that the timings matched exactly up. I wonder how he would have felt when he'd heard that, when he realized it definitely wasn't a coincidence, that this was because of Jesus' word. Location does not matter to God. Jesus can heal anywhere. If you're watching online and you need healing, God can meet you right now. I think it's really important for us to note that healings across the New Testament look very, very different. There's no one-size-fits-all simple formula, which I think is something that we as the wider church may struggle with. We live in a be this, do this, say this culture. And we really want everything to follow our nice, neat little rules. If this was the case, we could simply say to people we know are suffering, do this, pray this, say this, and then you'll be healed. And that would be so comforting to be able to give that answer. But that's not how it works. And that's not the reality we find ourselves in. And there's no simple biblical formula for healing, which may feel surprising to some of us. We might not have ever thought about it or realized that. But I think it's unrealistic to have an expectation of God working rigidly, sticking to a specific framework, especially in light of how different we all are. We have different needs, different illnesses, different stories, different pressures. And the one who knows all this, who knows all these things, is Jesus. And it's him in his godly authority who gets to determine not only the method and location of healing, but when it happens. If I'm truly honest with you all, healing is a topic that I struggle with, and Dave can attest to this because many a Monday afternoon I've put my head on the desk in his office and just been like, I don't understand. Sometimes. And I think part of why I struggle was due to a background of being raised in a church which had a massive emphasis on healing, which isn't wrong, can I just clarify, but I always felt that the church needed to see something visible, something shift there and then, and that was where the emphasis was placed. And I struggled with this insistence. It's easy to make healing a bit of a party trick that we get to witness. This wasn't the case for the official. Jesus didn't feel the need to perform a big, miraculous, grand gesture. The point was the healing of the son, not the how or the when or the where it happened. In verse 48, Jesus speaks against this attitude, which demands the visible, when he says, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." This can seem like quite a brash statement to make in response to the official. However, the you here is actually a plural. So Jesus, therefore, is making a wider statement to the Gentile, non-Jewish world to take notice of. And I think it speaks strongly into our culture today, where we can be somewhat desperate for the supernatural and the strange. I was actually in Costa earlier talking to the barista there, and he was saying, "What are you doing this evening?" So I said, "I'm talking on healing at my church." And he was like, "Oh, is that like in America when those crazy things happen? And it's really weird." And that was the concept that he had of it. And unfortunately, that conversation got cut short because I really wanted to go into more detail, but keep praying for him. There was no fireworks here. There was nothing to see, really. Instead, the story we get painted for us is a real father who's bereft over the suffering of his son. And when we talk about healing, it's essential that we frame it in the context of reality. We are talking about real people, real lives, real stories, and real emotions, whether pain, frustration, confusion, anger. It's really important that we remember that. The official was willing to take Jesus at his word and walk away with no visible assurance of improvement in his son. It's that in verse 50. And he showed that he had faith that Jesus can heal anywhere. Do we have that same faith?
Immediately after that story, John tells another story. Follows straight on in verse 1 of chapter 5. And John's doing something that he likes to do quite a lot in his writing, which is to put two things side by side so that we'll compare and contrast them. Lydia said that there's no one-size-fits-all to the way that God moves in healing, and she's right. And that's shown by the fact that there's a completely different story placed right next to this first one that we've already looked at. So let's read together from the beginning of chapter 5. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Hebrew Bethesda, your Bible might say Bethsaida, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. It's a completely different story from the first one. And in a moment, Lydia is going to sort of do a bit more compare and contrast between the two. But I want to focus on this one. We've talked about the fact that healing can happen anywhere, that where we are and who we're around and all those sorts of things doesn't matter for God. Healing can also take place in this story anytime. There's no schedule put on it by God. Sometimes we can try and impose a schedule. So this whole Sabbath thing going on here. This story really throws up the question of Sabbath. The Jewish people were not happy with what had happened. First, because this man that they saw carrying his mat was doing something that he shouldn't do on the Sabbath, because God had asked his people to rest on the Sabbath, not to do any work. And people had added more and more and more rules onto that. Because it's what we like to do, isn't it? We like to know, okay, this is what we need to do. So let's build a bit more into that. Let's add more rules so that we know where we stand, so that we can sort of compare ourselves with other people. And so they'd made all kinds of more rules around this. And so this guy even carrying his own mat was considered to be too much work for someone to be doing on the holy day. And then when they find out that Jesus has healed on that day, that he's performed a healing miracle, they're even more upset. Because if carrying your mat is bad, then doing some healing, that's definitely off on the Sabbath. And they're not happy with it. It doesn't fit in with their timescales, doesn't fit in with their rules, with their ideas of what should and shouldn't happen. They're far more interested in the rules being kept, in their rules being listened to by everyone, than they are in the fact that someone has been healed, in the fact that someone's life has been turned around. Maybe for us, we don't have that sort of mindset. I think if God were to move in healing tonight, and I pray he does, then I don't think many of us would go, well, it is the Lord's day. But maybe there's something to learn here about the fact that God works outside of the ways that we might want or expect. The fact that for these people it was the Sabbath, but what is it for us? What kind of rules, what kind of boxes do we try and put Jesus in? Where actually he won't be constrained. He's not happy to be constrained. He's not going to say, okay, well, I guess I'll only do things your way, Dave. Instead, I need to be able to say to him, let me do things your way, Jesus, even when I don't understand what they are. Maybe it's to do with the words that are used, or the things that we say, or the way that we look, or the practices we have. But what is it where Jesus actually wants to break outside of that and say, I'm going to do things in my time? One of the things he says to the people who criticize him is that his Father is still working, and so he is still going to be working. Makes things even worse for his situation because they're now accusing him not just of working on the Sabbath, but of blasphemy. But he doesn't care, because what he said is true. And friends, I believe God is still at work. God is still on the move. The Father is still working, and so the Son is still working. And the Spirit is working in us, which means we have work to do. We don't get to decide that we're going to wait until God picks up his tools again before we start working. God is on the move. So we have the choice to either partner with him in that, or try and resist that and say, I don't like your timing. I don't like what you're doing. But the other thing Jesus upsets here is not for the crowds, but it's for the man himself. And it's not to do with timescales and rules and regulations. It's to do with the ways that he's expecting things to happen. When Jesus asks him this strange question, which I'll think about in a moment, do you want to be made well? In verse 7, his response is, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water's stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me. Doesn't seem like an answer to the question that's being asked. But it is, because when Jesus is saying, do you want to be made well, it's as if his motivations and his priorities are being questioned. And he's trying to explain why he hasn't been made well yet. And an understanding that was had at the time was that this particular pool, which was a sort of natural spring and every so often would bubble up, their understanding was that it bubbling up was because an angel had gone down into the water and stirred it up. And whoever was first in would get some of those, would get the healing properties, and they would be healed. So if you're closer to the pool, or if you have someone to help you get down at that moment, then you can be healed. So Jesus says, do you really want to be made well? And he's saying, oh, no. It's not my fault that I've been here for 38 years and not been healed. It's because I haven't been able to do that yet. He's looking to the pool for his healing. And it's been a long time that he's been doing that, 38 years of thinking, if I'm ever healed, it's going to be because I get into the pool first. And Jesus is saying to him two things. He's saying, do you want to be made well? If so, look to me. But the other part of that is, if you want to be made well, stop trusting in those things that you think are going to make you well, because they're not going to. Sometimes we don't just want Jesus to work on our timescales. We want him to work with our methods. We want him to do things the way we want him to do things, or the way that we think things should be done. What if Jesus wants to do something totally different than that? He can break the rules that we might have. He can also break the patterns that we think are better. But what about this question? Do you want to be made well? What's that mean? Why does Jesus ask? Isn't it obvious? Isn't the question obvious? There's another time when Jesus heals someone who's blind. And Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? They're both questions that I find confusing because, well, of course the answer is, I want you to heal my sight. And of course the answer is, yes, I do want to be made well. But in one of the questions, I think what Jesus is doing is he's saying, what do you want me to do for you? Name it. Have the courage, have the boldness to say out loud, to tell me what it is you want. Instead of asking me to guess, I know, I'm Jesus, but I want you to place it before me. I want you to name it. I want you to say what it is. I want you to involve me in your desires. And in this question, do you want to be made well? It's more a question of willingness. Willingness for the consequences of that. This man's whole community over 38 years has been built up around these pools with these other people. Is he willing to lose that? Is he willing to lose his income? No one's going to give him money as a beggar anymore if he's no longer unwell. So is he willing for that? But also, is he willing to turn his eyes and look in the other direction? You can always picture the scene where he's sat facing the pool so that he can see it as soon as it bubbles up. I like to imagine, it's a little bit of artistic license, that Jesus is sort of stood the other side. And he's saying, do you want to be made well? And it forces his face to turn, whether that happened physically or not. It is what's going on in the passage. Jesus is saying, turn away from looking to the pool to be made well. Look to me instead. It wasn't what he was expecting. It wasn't on the timescales that other people were happy with. But Jesus didn't care. Jesus can do what he wants to do whenever he wants to do it. And on this question of healing, there's a reality that I think is really important to remember, which is that for all those who are God's children, all those who have received him and accepted him and believed in him, Jesus will heal. Might not be on the timescale that we want. Might not be in this life. I will one day be made completely whole. Maybe I'll get to see some more of that before I die. But the moment that I do, the moment that I pass into eternity, I will be made completely whole. Completely whole. Healed in every possible way. So, I think we need to remember, when we ask Jesus to move in power in our midst, in healing, it's important to do so in a way that says, I want you to do that now. But I also know that I'm going to submit my timescales to you. I'm not going to demand that you do things at the times that I want. I'm going to leave that in your hands.
So, as Dave shared, these two stories don't have a lot in common. And because of their placement next to each other, we can safely assume that John wants to draw out that contrast. Two different healings for two very different people. Healing is for anyone, just as Jesus' overall ministry in John's Gospel is. Like Dave said earlier, John likes to put two kind of contrasting events next to each other. So in chapters 3 and 4, we see Jesus giving teaching to both a skeptical Jew, who's a man, and a Samaritan woman. So let's compare these two healing accounts. On the one hand, we've got a royal official's son, a person of privilege. And on the other hand, we've got a beggar man who's been an invalid for 38 years. He would have been considered an outcast. But Jesus doesn't look to status to determine healing. Whilst I think it is fair to say that God has a special heart for the poor and outcast in society, his ministry extends to everyone. As a church, we find ourselves in a comparatively affluent area. God still wants to work miracles amongst us. Wealth doesn't stop us from getting ill. Healing can also happen regardless of age or generation. Here, both a child and an adult are healed. Let us not make the mistake of thinking that God is limited by the restrictions we so often put on him. We are quick to write off generations, whether that's the older members of society, maybe that's the youth of society. I think at different times it's different people. There is a whole spectrum of illness throughout ages. And God cares about every single person, regardless of age. For the son, the impression given is that it was probably a short-term illness. Yes, it was severe and that he was on the point of death, but it was an illness. For the beggar in John 5, this is a condition he's had for 38 years. He's weathered a lifetime of suffering. God cares about the smallest ailment to the biggest disease that we can name. And you may be sitting here thinking that God wants to heal everybody else, that everybody else is more important, that their problem is far bigger, greater, more significant than yours. That's not who God is. That's not the way God works. He cares about your broken heart. He cares about emotional healing. He cares about your knee surgery. He cares about your mental health. Two different locations are also specified, Galilee and Jerusalem, suggesting again that Jesus is Lord over all geography, over all the land. His power to heal doesn't come from his location. When we pray for healing, it doesn't have to be in the context of this church building. One final contrast that I think is probably one of the biggest contrasts. The official seeks out Jesus. He makes a journey to beg him for that healing. Whereas the paralyzed man was sought out by Jesus. I don't know why he picked that man. There was a lot of people around who he could have spoken to, but he chose that particular person. Sometimes healing can happen because of our persistence in prayer and our willingness to carry on petitioning God. Sometimes, however, healing happens when it maybe hasn't been asked for quite so dramatically, which may injure our sense of justice somewhat. We have to keep coming back to the profound truth that God knows what he is doing, that Jesus knows what he is doing, that he is the creator and we are his created. So I've just shared there are so many contrasts at play here, which should show us that God heals regardless of the obstacles that we might think stop him. John's technique of having these contrasts is to make this emphatic point and the consistent emphasis of the signs as Dave was sharing at the beginning. Just gave you an upgrade there. It's not just to showcase Jesus' power, but it's in order to showcase Jesus' character. It is Jesus who is the common denominator of both stories, which makes him the key component. It is Jesus who we are meant to look to, and it is Jesus who heals anyone, regardless of status, regardless of standing in society, regardless of age, gender, location. Healing is not conditional on who we are. Interestingly, these healings led to two different responses, which I think highlights the individuality that Jesus anticipates from us, a very diverse bunch of people. For the official, his whole Gentile household witnessed this miracle, and they believed. They believed that Jesus was powerful. It changed their life. The beggar, however, isn't able at first to identify who healed him. When he's asked, he's just like, I don't know. And it's not until Jesus speaks to him again that he realizes who it is, and then goes to tell the Jews. And this is the beginning of the Jews' public conflict against Jesus. Verses 16 to 18 of chapter 5 say this: Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, My Father is still working, and I also am working. For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. So whilst in John 4, healing led to miraculous belief, here it leads to this massive controversy that Dave was talking about over the Sabbath. And it makes it sadly apparent that the Jews' love of the law had become greater than their love of people being made well. Are we in danger of reaching the same place where we can recommend a theology of doing works to earn healing, rather than teaching that God can heal in a moment, and that his priority is people's well-beings, not what is expected, not following the rules? Jesus' glory, so his identity, his character, his name, is revealed in these chapters. We see something of who he is. And he is supreme over sickness because of that godly identity as son. It's important for us to remember that we don't believe in Jesus primarily because he heals, but rather simply because we know, because of who we know him to be. The character of Christ is enough for anyone and everyone. There is a university, I'm just trying to say that word. There is an inclusivity about this. We all know something of sickness, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's the more evasive idea of sin tainting our lives. We know that we are not as we were created. We know that something is wrong with humanity. We can look at our world in desperation, longing for something to make sense of it all. We're at odds with our Maker. And I think it's fair to say that we are all in need of healing of some kind. But cure has its implications. For the royal official, it meant a life transformation in the form of belief. For the beggar, as Dave touched upon, it meant a complete shift in his livelihood and his community. And both of them, it stopped them from being comfortable where they were. What might it mean for us? God can do, and he does do, the impossible. And the crazy, wonderful thing is that his healing power isn't just limited to the Bible. It isn't just gone in history. This is something that can happen here, now. His healing power is available for us. Jesus will forever be Lord over all, which includes sickness, suffering, and even death. We don't get to simply forget the message of Easter. Now it's 2 weeks on, we've inhaled our chocolate and done our Easter services. We have hope because Jesus is alive. And because of that, there is hope even in the middle of the most tragic circumstances. Are we willing to look to Jesus when it seems crazy? Maybe there's that pool, like Dave was talking about. Maybe are we willing to take our eyes off our idea of what we think should happen and turn them instead to Jesus? Are we willing to take him at his word, like the official, even when we don't see anything? Are we willing to trust even when life really doesn't make much sense at all? As Christians, we can be so profoundly good at missing the point. We can stare at the signpost. We can get fixated on the healing rather than the healer. It's Jesus Christ who has the power to heal any place, any time, anyone. But nothing is as good as knowing him.
So as I invite Josh and the band to come back up and just to play gently for a moment. 2 stories, very different. Two signs both pointing to the same truth, that Jesus heals. Both inviting a response of faith, whether that's the faith that seeks Jesus out before seeing the sign, whether that's the faith that's simply turning away from the things that we've been looking to make us whole, and instead looking to Jesus. I want to give you just a minute or so in quiet as maybe Josh just gently plays in the background, to ask yourself the question, what do I make of that sign? I don't know why you're here tonight or why you're joining online. Maybe you've been dragged along. Maybe you have come actively searching and seeking for Jesus. What do you make of it? What would your response of faith be? Where are you at on that journey? And if you could ask Jesus to do one thing and work healing in your life, where would that be?